I want to start this review by saying that I really wanted to love this game. As someone who enjoys weird games with crazy stories, this should have been a perfect pick for me. I love those because they initially confuse you, then the rules and the lore of the world slowly start making sense and it all suddenly clicks. At some point, there's usually a twist and your mind is blown. Essentially, the video game equivalent of movies like Interstellar, Inception, and to some degree Tenet. So to me, Death Stranding was yet another masterpiece I was to discover. At least I hoped so, but sadly it let me down. Before I start telling you about this game's many problems, let's first talk about the Ultrawide support. Actually, that was not a good transition because the Ultrawide is actually one of its problems. You see, it supports 21:9 somewhat. You're probably wondering, what's that even supposed to mean? Well, in short, there are small black bars on the sides of your screen if you're playing that resolution. Looking at this footage I took, you will know what I'm talking about. This is how the game would look if you used it in 21:9 as the game offers it. First time I saw this, I assumed I had set it up wrong, but no, this is it. Luckily, there are fixes which are easily available and solve this issue without problems, allowing you to play in proper 21:9 as well as in 32:9, and trust me, it is definitely worth using them since the game looks amazing at times. So being able to see more at once is a real treat for the player. But let this be said, they didn't get it right with the first version of the game and they have failed again with the so-called director's cut. Sadly, as stated before, the Ultrawide is only one issue in Death Stranding's bundle of problems. Let's first talk about the story. Japanese games, and especially Kojima's, have always had convoluted stories which are not easily understood, but they still obeyed the formula I've mentioned before. They are explained at some point, somewhat understood by the player, and lead up to a huge reveal and plot twist. While this is definitely still the case here in Death Stranding, I would say that it's written in a way that seems convoluted for the sake of being convoluted. At the start of the game, the player is bombarded by stupid abbreviations, which when explained only sound even stupider. You constantly hear about BTs, BBs, EEs, and more. It's like the script was written by someone who wanted to confuse his friends and feel really smart in the process, but the result is simply frustrating and annoying. Not to mention that we as the player are not even allowed to know as much as our protagonist Sam knows within the first initial 2/3 of the game. I'm not gonna give you any specifics since my reviews are always spoiler free, but know that the story is barely going to be explained at first. And when I say at first, I mean the first 40 to 80 hours depending on how much you decide to invest into side activities. Then within the last 10 hours, all of it will be dumped on the player at once. This approach makes the pacing of the game seem completely inappropriate and leads to extreme boredom during the 40 to 80 hours of which I spoke. More about that when I get to the part where I discuss the gameplay. So since we're still at the story, let's talk characters. Norman Reedus, who I only know as Daryl from AMC's The Walking Dead, was hired to stand in as our protagonist Sam Porter Bridges. This is not a bad cast at all, but if you've played Metal Gear Solid 5, you'll immediately be reminded of Kiefer Sutherland, who was cast as the protagonist there and only had a handful of voice lines since they wanted to save money. Yep, they did it again. Sam will talk a bit during some cutscenes and occasionally to himself, but most of the time he will act like a silent protagonist. NPCs will talk to him and he will just look and not respond, or at best give them a small nod. It feels weird and annoying and is almost immediately noticeable. I'd rather have a random face on my character than a TV show actor who only talks like a normal person occasionally. If they can't afford having him talk all the time as he should, they should just hire someone cheaper, is all I'm saying. As for the rest of the characters, they're mostly boring as well. In addition to that, Sam's motivation is very confusing to us. The game basically starts by telling us that a woman is held captive at a place and Sam has to go save her. We're never really told who that woman is or what her connection to our protagonist is supposed to be. Just that she is to be the next US president. The president of a country which in this game no longer exists, but can be reborn if Sam connects a bunch of places together through something called the chiral network, which is essentially future internet. It's all intentionally secret. So then we are sent out on our first delivery jobs, and this is where we are introduced to the gameplay. You get a bunch of packages, then travel to your next destination while trying not to topple over and break or damage the goods. In addition to that, you can find lost deliveries or materials around the map and take them along as well. At first, the whole gameplay cycle feels like a relaxing experience. It's made even better by the fact that the game has a great licensed soundtrack, but even that comes with its own set of issues. You see, when you are resting at a base, you can actually select which songs to listen to at any time. However, as soon as you start traveling, and I want to emphasize that this is the thing you will be doing 90% of the time, the game will only play the songs occasionally at its own discretion. Most of the time, you will only be listening to sound effects. There's no way for you to use the music player outside of the room, which is very disappointing. I actually ended up starting YouTube in the background and simply playing the songs manually. After some time, the game will even provide you with a vehicle, multiple in fact. Literally all of them drive terribly. And it's not just because the terrain is horrible. This is by design and is what effectively presents the challenge in the game. No, they just feel extremely clunky in general. Luckily, Sam controls really nicely when on foot, but the problem is that once the game offers you a vehicle, the distances will increase substantially and moving on foot becomes a test of your patience. Of course, you will have to do it if your vehicle breaks down or your battery drains and you have no way of recharging it due to bad preparation before the mission, which will occasionally happen because, let's be honest, preparing before the mission is kind of annoying sometimes, and at least I was the kind of guy who would often just, get going and see what happens. Luckily for you, there are ladders and ropes which can be used to scale the hostile terrain and will enable you to take shortcuts. This is where another problem comes into play. The ultra-wide fix could be flagged as some sort of cheating, resulting in a ban. So the player has to choose between playing an ultra-wide or playing online because, in order to not get banned, you need to be offline. I chose the former, but that only made the game more difficult. The reason for that being the fact that there are structures which can be crafted by players and accessed by everyone. This makes your life so much easier, the main one being a highway, which is not only nice and flat and perfect for all of your package delivery needs, but also powers your vehicles, meaning that their batteries will not be drained while on them. But that's just one example. And while playing alone may be more solitary, it does feel like it's a more natural experience. You are forced to really plan your trips, take risky routes in order to save time, and this makes the game a lot more challenging. Truth be told, almost everyone would take the highways when those are presented. I only wish that they had made the cost of building them much lower when playing offline. That way a solo player could also craft them and have something to work towards. I made 2 sections on my own and it took me hours of grinding to do it. Needless to say, no normal player should try to build these structures alone. It would simply take weeks, if not months, of grinding to do solo. You see, you have to build them, but the amounts of materials that are required are extreme. So working together with other players makes this task a lot more manageable, not to mention that if you're someone who joins the game a bit later, everything's already built so you can just profit from it. The game's challenge is enhanced additionally by offering us environmental hazards such as a special type of damaging rain, a group of bandits who will try to steal your stuff, and last but not least, the monsters of the game known as BTs. Now the rain's not too bad, it will damage your cargo if you expose yourself to it for too long, but there are special items which can be used to fix that. The bandits are actually a fun addition to the whole experience. There are weapons in the game, non-lethal ones at first, which help you deal with those enemies. Why non-lethal, you ask? Well, the game will teach you that in this world, the monsters known as beached things, or simply BTs, are born when a person dies, but their body is not cremated. There's an additional problem, however. If such a monster is created and it comes into contact with a living being shortly after, it causes what is known as a void out, which in essence is an explosion which rivals the power of the largest nukes ever deployed. Therefore, nobody uses lethal force anymore, since killing anyone has the consequence that you have to now cremate them, but you can't simply do that anywhere either. For this, you need to use special incinerators, which are very few and far between and usually positioned outside of cities, since the cremation itself causes smoke, which again can cause anomalies and is therefore dangerous as well. As you can see, the game makes sure you can't actually kill anyone early on and only provides lethal weapons later. If you then decide you want to deal with having to go to the only incinerator around, which in some cases can be up to half an hour away from you, if not even more, then that's up to you. By then you are expected to know what the consequences are. Should you just leave the bodies and go about your business? You will suddenly be faced with Death Stranding's game over screen. What's interesting is that this does not happen if you die normally. Upon normal death, Sam enters a separate dimension and has to find his way back to his body, which will cause him to simply resurrect himself. This is because he's a repatriate, an immortal being if you will. He also has dooms, which is divided into different levels. In his case, he can sense the BTs around him, which makes him particularly good as a delivery guy, since sensing them makes it possible to avoid them as well. I did mention how the game has tons of stupid abbreviations, did I not? Well, as you can see, I did not lie. And so we come to the bridge babies, also known as BBs. That weird baby in a jar you carry with you basically. This baby will help indicate the direction of the monsters and the distance to those, but you still have to manually make Sam hold his breath if the enemies are close. By doing this, you can avoid them, or you can choose to go in hot and fight the things, which I sometimes did in order to spice the game up, and it was kind of a cool experience. As the game provides you with many more ways to deal with them over time, it will also inevitably make the encounters more interesting, but we mustn't forget that carrying many tools and weapons means that you cannot carry that many packages, so inventory management will be one of your primary tasks. At first, all of this was quite entertaining, but after about 10 hours it started getting stale. I began caring less and less about non-story related deliveries and random packages. This is the pacing problem I've mentioned earlier. You will realize that most environments aren't very pretty to look at either, and since there are no animals or anything else to interact with besides the bandits and the occasional monsters, the latter of which are anyway quite invisible, it will all become boring quickly. And it did. At the 15-hour mark, I was actually getting really bored and looking for some videos on YouTube which I could play in the background while carrying packages in the game. You'll also begin to notice the more annoying aspects of Death Stranding, such as the baby's cries whenever you trip and fall. Once it does start crying, you can either play a mini game where you have to shake it at just the right speed in order to calm it down, or you can simply ignore it and move on since you don't want to be bothered with such nonsense. The problem with this second option is you now have a crying baby for the next few minutes, which is even more annoying. At one point, the game will offer you a special form of teleportation as means of fast travel. The problem here is that it only works for Sam and none of his gear or packages, meaning that it's pretty much useless, so useless in fact that I only used it twice in all of my hours of playing. In the late game, Death Stranding even took that function away from me temporarily. I was thinking to myself that this can't be a good sign, and damn it, I was correct. Shortly after I had reached the other end of the continent, the game told me that there's an emergency in the first city, the one I had started Death Stranding in, which is way over at the other end of the continent. And guess what? I had to go there, but sadly the fast travel was not available at that exact time, so I had to do it the old-fashioned way. This was the point at which it became clear that Death Stranding was now wasting my time, and boy was I pissed. Without spoiling any story elements, I will tell you that at one point you have to watch a section of the game's credits before you can progress a little, then watch another section, and so on for multiple times until you actually do get to progress. It literally forces you to wait through the credits as a form of slowing you down during gameplay. And once you beat the game, the credits will play again, unskippable of course, so that you can really let those names sink in. Ultimately, Death Stranding is extremely ambitious, but fails on so many levels for me. The gameplay is boring and simply not fun after a few hours. The story is poor and its pacing is absolutely terrible. Most characters are very bland, including our protagonist, who as mentioned acts like an antisocial weirdo for the most part and seems to not even acknowledge that people are talking to him since Kojima wanted to save on voice acting costs. The game was simply a massive disappointment, and I was only able to force myself to finish it because I planned on reviewing it. It was just bad, and that upsets me because, as I've said at the beginning, I actually wanted to love this game. I generally like Kojima's weird style, and I'm hopeful he will keep doing what he does best, but this time it was simply not nearly enough. Or perhaps it was too much? It's hard to tell, honestly, but whichever, it definitely misses the mark for me, so I cannot recommend this game. With that having been said, I'd like to thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope the review was entertaining and informative, and would be happy, actually very happy, if you checked out my other ones. Until then, dear viewer, have a great day. This is Nino signing out.